There we are. Good morning, everybody. Today, I'm Kieran from the Berkeley Research Group, and we're going to talk about the changing role of government and regulators with respect to the policy work we've done with blockchain, but broadly thinking about those principles for other emerging technologies. And we're going to talk about our experiences at the implementation level with Her Majesty's government in the UK, and at the policy level, working with the Emirate of Abu Dhabi. And finally, some principles for other forward-looking jurisdictions. This is always good.
Should we just click the arrow?
Just click the arrow there. But first, government priorities.
Now, in our work around the world, speaking to governments, we're never asked to advise on an emerging technology in the abstract. Governments, policymakers, regulators, they're asking themselves some really interesting questions, but the pursuit of technological advancement just isn't one of those things, and nor should it be. Governments have got really big fish to fry. They've got security and privacy. They've got ageing societies. They're desperately trying to equip their citizens and residents with the skills that they need to survive and thrive in the 21st century. Now, let's look for a moment at an example of an emerging tech discourse done right. And I think the best example of this is 5G. Almost universally, governments are really excited and positive about 5G technology, just as they were for 4G and 3G before it. Now, that isn't some sudden enthusiasm for MIMO antennas or the utilisation of a broader spectrum range. They don't care. They want 5G because they think it will make their users' mobile internet connections slightly quicker. And economic growth will come from that by the creation of more and better content. Blockchain doesn't have that reason for being yet. It doesn't have that mission. And our fundamental message is that in order to create an environment in which investment will flow and innovation will flow, the public sector focus and the policy narrative has got to align the technology to one of those big ticket items. The tech's got to find that large, that politically legitimate, and that socially beneficial reason for being. And it's got to exist at a nation-state level.
As we've heard from other speakers today, regulation in this space is suffering from a lack of education and understanding. And the dominant thinking is that the approach to regulation of blockchain, but also to other advanced tech, is outdated, it's narrow, and predominantly rear vision mirror focused. The as-is or current situation could really be characterized as being mostly market and entrepreneurial-led, solution-centric, chasing the money and short-term. It's also, by and large, very reactionary. The majority of regulation to date or regulatory cautionary notes have been sort of warnings about things that have just happened retrospectively. And it tends to focus on solving purely market failures with very, very long lags in between. An example of the negative impacts of this sort of as-is approach, take the global financial crisis. Regulators didn't understand the products, they didn't understand the technology, it got away from them with very, very bad outcomes for all. The 2B situation, the one we believe in and advise and research and write on, sees a place where regulation of advanced tech has co-leadership between the industry, the entrepreneurs, and the regulators and the government. It's anticipatory, it's looking forward. Regulators have taken the time and invested in becoming competent in the technologies. They've taken the time to educate themselves on the risks and the benefit of the technology, particularly as it's been widely used and pervasive across the economy. And the entrepreneurial community and the regulators have come together to focus on actively shaping a set of market outcomes they both see as desirable for the social good. And by doing nothing, this also has ramifications. A very interesting piece of research from IE University Madrid recently looked at Europeans' attitudes towards the governance of advanced technology. And I thought the outcome was actually quite concerning. 67% of those surveyed said the governance of new and advanced technology is, with climate change, the biggest, most concerning issue facing Europe. 70% of Europeans of all ages in the sample said They believe if advanced technology is not appropriately controlled, new tech will cause more harm than good to society in the coming decade. So by doing nothing and not providing a clear policy framework and permissive regulation, citizens' sentiment to advanced tech is souring. And ultimately that will drip into politics and ultimately probably produce oppressive regulation in the future that's reactionary and harmful to innovation. Now, an example of our work at the implementation end of town.
The good news is all of these things Kieran has talked about, governments are waking up to it, and they realise that they need to fulfil more of a leadership role within their industries, and we've been really fortunate to have been a part of it. For the last 12 months, we've been working alongside Her Majesty's Land Registry in the UK, and just a couple of weeks ago, we publicly announced the completion of the first digitised end-to-end residential property transaction in the UK. I know it's been done elsewhere, but actually, given the complexity of the Land Registry's legacy systems and the various quirks of English law, this is a pretty big deal. And it's an example of the Land Registry making steps to try to get to the forefront of the technology and enjoy the economic and social benefits that just flow from having quicker, more transparent, and more efficient real estate transaction processes. Just a word on the tech, it was built on Corda, it was a very closed network, 24 handfuls of nodes. We hosted a couple of them, Her Majesty's Land Registry hosted a couple of them, the lending and the redeeming bank and the buying and the selling conveyancer hosted as well. The phase 2 of the engagement will look to bring HMRC, our tax authority, into the process to allow the payment of stamp duty, the tax we pay on transfer of land in the UK, automatically as part of the platform.
And as well as work at the implementation end, we've done work at the policy end. I've spent a lot of time in the UAE. I've had enough grilled chicken and hummus to last a lifetime, frankly. And we've done some great work with the government of Abu Dhabi on their wide digital transformation program, but also specifically some policy guidance for blockchain technology. We looked at the technology in its broader sense and what's been happening around the world, obviously a great deal of research on behalf of the government to help them become more competent and educated in the technology. The guidance is mandatory for the government sector, but it's only directive for private firms, as much as to say the government didn't have a position on the technology, and now it does, and it's very positive, and it's open for business, and we want to sandbox and incubate and support innovation across the government sector. We also considered the high-level economic impacts, new business models, and technological impacts as the technology becomes more pervasive. We also went to great lengths to consider some of the riveting legal issues and challenges facing the Emirate. Tom, please tell us more.
So we started to try and build a conceptual framework for the ecosystem within which the innovation and the investment will flow. And we did start at the most basic, granular level. Definitions. And I can hear Kieran muttering, typical lawyer, next to me, but I just want to stress how mission critical this is. We're all guilty of it. You need to be very clear that when we're talking blockchain, we're talking the specific subset of DLT. This gets lost in conversation. And at a public sector level, that ambiguity leads to ambiguous regulation. And ambiguous regulation is bad regulation. Bad regulation crushes innovation and investment. Establishing that common language is absolutely essential from the very outset. It was one of the activities we undertook out there. We also looked at the principles upon which the technology would be governed, it would be overseen, and it would be regulated. And again, the common theme here is the word consistency. Competent regulators are logical. Logic breeds consistency. Consistency reduces risk. And an environment with less risk enables much greater innovation and investment. And establishing that whole governance regime, it's really important. There's some sort of fundamental playbook and reference architecture that can be referred back to at a later date. And building a document that is a living document and yet sufficiently future-proofed is quite hard work. It requires a knowledge of the prevailing legal and regulatory issues, and in particular, their intersection with the technology and the technology's direction of travel. Think zero-knowledge proofs, the move to interoperable abstraction layer solutions, think delegated consensus protocols. These are all of the things that are now on the peripheries of our tech that the legal and regulatory frameworks have got to be asking themselves now, how do we deal with that, and how does that change our existing analysis? The final element of the initial engagement in Abu Dhabi was the development of a robust use case evaluation mechanism. And this starts at a very high level with the sorts of questions that any investor should ask of the companies that they are thinking about investing into. What's their product? Does anyone want it? Who are the team behind it? Have they got a track record? Are they culturally compatible with the government and their long-term mission? And later on, you're going to have a talk from Katie from State Zero Labs, and she's going to give a talk called Blockchain Bullshit. And I know one of her core messages is that people just lose sight of these fundamental questions when launching and evaluating blockchain-enabled startups and solutions, just because it's got the word blockchain-enabled in the title. For nation-state level projects, a number of more technical questions are also relevant. How does the solution fit into the existing legacy framework systems? Questions of scalability and interoperability with other DLT solutions are really important, and it's very key that all of the stakeholders within the public sector are using the same evaluation mechanism. Finally, we've just got to be really mindful. Blockchain is not the only show in town, and there are many other emerging technologies which can be used by governments to solve real-world problems. To look at any emerging tech, any DLT such as blockchain, any other emerging tech, AI, machine learning, IoT, 5G, robotics, the list goes on and on. To look at any of them in isolation is to totally miss the point. We've helped the government of Abu Dhabi to try and navigate this minefield and make a policy framework that will last.
And it was not straightforward. A small example of how not straightforward it was, blockchain in Arabic as a word doesn't really exist. We started to go around with box chain, and we sort of went from there. So we were starting from a challenging condition. But ultimately, the pain we went through and the exercise we went through put both the government and all its entities, 54 of them, in a much better position to understand what's going on in the blockchain space, but also it will serve as a valuable blueprint as they consider other advanced technologies in the Emirate, 5G, IoT, artificial intelligence, machine learning. The work produced a number of quite valuable, we think, generalisable principles. And our work in Brussels with the European Blockchain Observatory and the INAPA, the Governance and Standards Group, these principles have actually been really helpful in trying to clarify and crystallise what could be a very difficult and complex conversation. And what do you know? Regulation appears.
It has, and we've already spoken about it at length. Permissive regulation is the key to growth, and that's one of the few universal truths in this and any market. But we actually think that's sort of where the one-size-fits-all approach ends. Without wanting to talk down my role here, the existence of blockchain alongside legal and regulatory frameworks is actually quite boring. We're really lucky. We've got lawyers who are all over the technical aspects of the emerging technologies, including blockchain, and we've got the expertise to figure out how existing legal frameworks can map over. Of course, as we heard in the talk before, hopefully with the assistance of some sort of clarificatory guidance from the regulators. What, to my mind, is far more interesting is the social, the political, the economic spheres within which these blockchains exist. And that's totally different from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and it evolves with time. It's really important that any solution is sufficiently future-proofed, and that's be it blockchain solution or otherwise, and it reflects these values and sentiments. There isn't a one-size-fits-all answer to these things, and anyone who tells you otherwise is just completely missing the point.
Another key guiding principle that really has come forward is in our travels, at this point in the technology life cycle and the hype cycle, we've become increasingly concerned with the level of influence some major vendors are having on both the policy making and strategy setting processes and also the technical development itself. And our strong view and advice to clients is at a system level is to avoid major vendor and technology lock-in and engineer a policy both in commissioning work and procuring technology that has open standards and interoperability at its core. We've also learned a lot of lessons from our friends up the road in Dubai, who are 3 years down the track from Abu Dhabi, that establishing a strong central coordination role in all blockchain policy and procurement decision-making can reduce complexity and costs and increase the feedback loops, because there's been some very valuable learnings in avoiding decentralising some of this development and policy making to entities or even into sectors, transport, education, that they've actually pulled back all of that decision making and all of those budgets centrally over the last 12 months. Another guiding principle is increasingly we're helping our clients see blockchain as a general purpose or enabling technology. Characteristics of a general purpose technology that are pervasive and widely adopted, capable of ongoing technical development, and often complementary to other innovations in the economy, spurring all sorts of industrial and commercial opportunities. And governments and regulators should see general purpose technologies in a different and more positive light than a non-general purpose technology, and resource themselves accordingly. But where to next? That is the big question. And we have several guiding principles we'd like to see forward-looking jurisdictions take into account.
Absolutely, and the good news is that for governments and the huge machinery that sits alongside them, stuff's starting to happen. We've got activity in the UK, we've had all sorts over Europe through Estonia and Georgia, we have West Virginian voting primaries, we have Delaware share solutions. Things are happening. But the reality is that the public sector still isn't quite up to speed with this technology, and it's up to the people in this room, those at the bleeding edge of the technology, the policymakers, the scholars, the inventors, the entrepreneurs, the lawyers, hopefully, to help shape that narrative and help shape that journey, hold the hands of governments and the public sector, and keep the principles of openness, open source coding, and fundamental long-term lifespan front and centre for the technology.
So you, the entrepreneurs, really do need, and this is clear and loud in all of our travels, is that you, the entrepreneurs, really do need to help regulators and government tie this technology to much larger socially and politically relevant missions, and be partners on that path to regulation, not adversaries. And things in Europe are happening. American venture capital is looking to Europe. Europe now has the moral high ground on technology regulation around privacy and around competition. And then blockchain can really be of service to these larger missions. But it has to happen in partnership, not in an adversarial way. So that's the challenge, is help these regulators become more educated and competent on the technology, and then bigger missions can emerge. Thank you.